Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's good to be with you. And I hope you enjoyed our double header, if you haven't figured it out yet. We did stream live earlier this morning from our Shabbat service. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Farley taught in our Shabbat service this morning, and so we live streamed that. We thought you'd enjoy it. And so if you were able to catch that, then you're about to enjoy the double header. We do want to go over the Torah portion again, so you're getting two good angles, I think, on the Torah portion. And as we look at what we have in Devarim today, I think I've uploaded already some past years. I don't remember exactly how many we've got uploaded here to YouTube for you. But this is such a rich Torah portion. It really is. And if you kind of look through Yeshua's quotations in the Gospels, I think you'll find out that a lot of those quotations, a good number of them are coming out of the book of Deuteronomy, or Devarim in Hebrew. So what I'd like to go over today is a very practical application of this particular Torah portion. I know sometimes we do deep studies and they're not immediately apparent in terms of practicality. Like, how can I practically apply this? I hope we're doing something in each lesson that you can say, hey, well, you know, I took this away from the lesson and I think I could apply this tomorrow. I think with this one, this is definitely a lesson we can apply tomorrow. And it's a long history in the Torah of people of faith being known as being hospitable. In this particular Torah portion, there's going to be a particular couple of nations who are going to be known as inhospitable. So the question is, will you be known for your hospitality, or will you be known for your hostility? There's not a huge difference in the two words in English, hostility or hospitality. And so let me share my screen with you so you can see what I see. And we're calling this a 2x4 generation. And yes, that is a 2x4 board. I don't know that these are called the same thing all over the world, maybe in South Africa or maybe in the UK. You know, they're going with metric measures. So if we say somebody got hit over the head by a 2x4, it may not have the same impact there. But if you are watching from another country, this is a American expression. And so when somebody gets hit over the head by a 2x4, we're talking about a pretty solid piece of lumber. In other words, they're thick-headed, and you have to whack them pretty hard over the head to get their attention. So in this Torah portion, I heard a rabbi teaching on this portion, and he referred to this generation, the first generation in the wilderness, as a 2x4 generation, because he said pretty much you had to hit them over the head with a 2x4 to get their attention. And so now we've arrived at the Torah portion Devarim, and Moses is addressing a second generation, maybe in some cases even a third generation. I guess it depends on, you know, how old they were when they came into the wilderness and so forth. But at any rate, this is a new generation that Moses is dealing with. It's not the same group that he brought out of Egypt with him, the 2x4 generation. And so as you read the beginning of the Torah portion, you see, of course, Devarim is words or things. And the title of the Torah portion is typically named after one of the first words in the Torah portion. And so when we read Ha'ele HaDevarim, then we read, these are the words. And this is one of the tips of the week. If you see the word Devarim because there's lots of Hebrew words that refer to types of speaking or saying. But if you see Devarim and Ele together in the same phrase, sometimes that's going to indicate that something bad is about to happen. And in this particular Torah portion, when we see Ele Hadvarim, then what we know is going to follow are words of rebuke from Moses to the Israelites. And that's why you'll see that Devarim seems to be written in a different style. The Moses in Devarim is a little more sure of himself in his rebuking the people than the Moses of the previous books. And he starts out with a long list of the mistakes that were made in the wilderness so that the Israelites could review that. You know, a good teacher, what does she do? What does he do? He reviews what you've learned before he tries to introduce some new things. And you will see some new things introduced in the book of Devarim, but it's going to start with a review. And the question is, why is this delivery different? Why are we saying his words are different? His style of addressing the Israelites is different? Well, the text itself, what we see with Devarim is that Moses is able to use more textual hints rather than the direct hit with the 2x4. For instance, he'll remind them of Tophel and Lavan. Well, Tophel is like quarreling, slanders, complaints, those sorts of things. Lavan is white. So rather than point out specific instances where they quarreled and slandered and complained, he just says Tophel. And rather than point out that they complained about the manna, which was Lavan or white, he says Lavan. And so this is a much more subtle way of speaking to this second generation. They have an ability to read deeper meanings when he's using the words. And what we notice about them is that they're standing there very quietly, listening to this travelogue of mistakes and errors, and they're not uttering a sound. They're just standing there accepting what Moses is saying. If he had made this same speech to the previous generation, there was a really good possibility they'd start arguing, they would rebel, they would shift blame to someone else, they would start complaining. And so he's much more direct with the 2x4 generation. With this generation, he's functioning, I believe, at a higher level. I think that's what the text is telling us in the difference in the two ways that he addresses them. So here's another question. What's so different about this generation, other than the fact that they're not so thick-headed? Well, it's the fact that they are standing there silently. They could point out something that's very obvious to us. These mistakes that Moses is pointing out, they apply to the previous generation. These are not the mistakes of the second generation. As Moses recounts every single place where there was a camp, where there was a problem, they're just standing there quietly and nobody's speaking up. It's like, oh, Moses, excuse me, Moses, a word, Moses, that wasn't us. Remember, that was our parents that did that. And, justifiably, they could have done that. Oh, Moses, you're talking to us like we did that, but we didn't do that. That was our parents. No, they're just standing there silently and they're accepting the rebuke that really should be landing on another generation. And what we see when someone does that is that they have developed a very high level of spiritual growth. Because what they're doing is they are accepting a rebuke that properly applies to someone else. So what would be the point of rebuking this generation and not saying, well, that generation died in the wilderness. They kind of paid for their sins that way. No need to mention it anymore. I might risk hurting their feelings if I bring it up. Moses doesn't take that approach. He very carefully recounts all the mistakes. And this generation is different. They stand there and they accept it because they believe they can learn something from it. They're so secure in who they are as that generation, they don't feel like they need to shift the blame. And that's typically what we do. If somebody scolds us for something we didn't do, we say, oh, no, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. That was so-and-so. But this generation says, you know what? Maybe that was our parents' generation. But as Moses is going through these mistakes, I can still learn something from my parents' mistakes. I don't want to repeat those mistakes. There's no reason, to get hit upside the head with a 2x4 if I can avoid it. And so a generation that will just silently accept a rebuke that belongs to someone else and say, hey, I'll still learn from it. That's a generation that's attained a pretty high spiritual level, because the most human thing in the world is we don't want to be scolded. We don't want to be rebuked. We don't want to be told that we don't measure up to expectations. We don't like for people to make us feel bad about ourselves, especially nowadays. It's all about, build me up, don't make me feel bad, don't make me feel guilty. And sometimes we need to feel guilty because it can change our future behavior. So this generation is benefiting from a rebuke that we know had a positive effect on their future behavior, because this generation followed Joshua like no other generation. And so we can either continue to be what I call offense Velcro. Every time somebody says something, we can internalize it and say, oh, they're talking about me, or they're accusing me, they're saying I'm not good enough. Or we can say, you know what, I don't really believe that applies to me, but let me learn something from what they're saying. There might be something come up in the future, and just hearing that word of rebuke, it might help me. It might come to mind at a moment when I really need it. And so what they've done is they've attained a level of self-sacrifice. And it was very difficult for the previous generation to take on that role of a sacrificial life at every turn. No matter how perfect their lives were, they tended to see imperfection. I mean, imagine they're in a cloud, divinely protected, divine bread, divine water. They've got Moses there to teach them. Their clothes aren't wearing out, their shoes aren't wearing out, and yet they tend to see their lives through a very different lens than we do. This particular generation has learned some lessons. And how do we know they weren't guilty of the errors that Moses is mentioning? Well, in Joshua 1:16 through 18, we get a little blurb here that tells us how different they were. They answered Joshua, saying, all that you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. It's kind of like the Mount Sinai statement, we will do and we will hear. Well, the Joshua generation also makes a very similar statement. And then they say, just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. So we're finding out in scripture right there, this particular generation that Moses is addressing, they've been obeying him in all things. And now they're telling Joshua, we'll obey you just like we obeyed Moses. And so an obedient generation stands there and accepts the rebuke of the word. And we do that every year. If we're reading on the Torah portion cycle, every year we'll hear these words of rebuke from Moses. And we can either feel very self-righteous and say, well, I didn't make that mistake. I didn't complain and say I wanted meat to eat. I didn't complain about the food. I didn't complain about the water. I didn't complain about the Amalekites. I didn't complain about the giants in the land. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Had I been in that place, I would have been just perfect. Well, the truth is maybe not. But the fact that we feel so good that we didn't do that tells us that maybe we're not the Joshua generation yet. We might have some spiritual work to do, because when we can stand there and read those words of rebuke, just like they were aimed at us. You did this, you did that, you did this, you did that. Why would we do that if we know we didn't do that? Because what they're accepting here is national identity, not individual identity. They're standing here as a nation. He says, you're going to become a nation today. Again, they were a nation at Sinai, but he says, you're going to become a nation again today. And it's because they have that sense of national identity. If it happens to my partner here, it's happening to me. If it happened to the previous generation of Israel, it's happening to me. We have that identity. And so the fact that we would stand here and say, okay, yeah, we rebelled, we sinned, we spoke evil, we did all these things. What are we doing? We're saying we're part of a nation. And just like you want, if possible, repent of the sins of your forefathers. I mean, sometimes things are just left open-ended. There's been an offense committed. There's been a sin. There's been some sort of trespass committed. And we say, well, I'm a different generation. Why should I apologize for something I never did? I never did these things. But if you see yourself as part of that nation, as part of that identity, then you know what? Repent and apologize, even if you never did it. That's part of taking ownership of your nation, of your identity as a people. And so just as we read the Torah portion, Devarim, and we say, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this, whether I did it or not, it's because I'm part of a body. I'm part of the body of Messiah. And so I will learn from hearing these words. It will equip me going forward into the future, so that if I were ever tempted to do this thing, maybe these words will come back to me and it will prevent me from committing this error. There's just no limit to the way that relationships can be healed when sometimes we're willing to apologize for something we don't really feel like we did wrong. And we don't really feel like we owe that apology. Well, maybe that's not really the question. Maybe the question is, would this apology heal the relationship and give us a sense of togetherness? Would it restore the relationship and say, you know, we're a nation, we're a family, we're a people? And so the characteristic of this generation is silence and sacrifice. And that's kind of the way that sacrifice works. Silence is supreme confidence in the salvation of Adonai. An acceptable sacrifice, it must be silent. If you'll notice something about the animals that were kosher for temple sacrifice, these are animals that tend to be silent when they are sacrificed. Like a lamb, I don't really want to go into graphic detail about slaughtering a lamb, but if you've ever witnessed that process, you know, they might fight and they might run around for a little while, but once they're caught, they really do kind of faint on you. They just kind of go limp. They become silent. They say that's what sets the dove apart as a sacrificial bird. It's not going to flail about and run around like a chicken with its head cut off. Well, maybe that wasn't the greatest analogy. They don't fight the sacrifice like some other birds. They tend to be silent in sacrifice. So Isaiah 53:7 says of Messiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. He has just been accused of every sin in the world that he has not done, and he takes every sin in the world upon himself and remains silent. At no point does he stop and say, I never did that, 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 or that, or that, or that, or that. He says, I'll take it, I'll take it, I'll take it, I'll take it. Whatever they did, I will take this, and I will not open my mouth. And that's what made him acceptable. That's what makes an acceptable sacrifice. The problem is now with the technology of our time, we have so many gadgets and so many ways of distracting ourselves from silent time. Because even if we say, okay, I'm going to sit here and have 10 minutes of silent time, not even an hour, let's say 10 minutes. I'm going to have 10 minutes of silent time. If your phone buzzed, would you look? If a question came to your mind and you thought, well, what? Would you Google it? And that's what technology does. It interrupts our silent times where we make these decisions to be a silent sacrifice. And instead of accepting responsibility and trying find ways to learn from errors, instead we jump on social media and scream. We're not silent. We don't meditate. We get on social media and we scream our opinions about these violations. But there is a power of silence in sacrifice. Think of Aaron. His two sons have basically just been sacrificed when Nadav and Avihu were burned up, and he's silent. He doesn't say a word. Wouldn't a normal father want to express his grief, his sorrow? Yes, but Aaron was not an ordinary man. He was an example to us, an encouragement to us that in the times of deep sorrow, it is possible to be silent and to contemplate, what does this mean? What am I supposed to learn from this? I may never find the explanation of why it happened on this side of the garden, but I can always answer a question eventually that says, what can I learn from this? And we don't ask those questions nearly enough. We simply react. We're almost like animals. That's what an animal does. They're instinctual. They react to things. They become angry, or they run away, or they whine, or they beg, or whatever. But we're not animals. He made us in his image. And if there can be half an hour of silence in heaven, then certainly we should be able to handle a half hour of silence when it comes to meditating upon his word. And instead of saying, I never did that, I wouldn't do that, or well, maybe I did this, but I would never do that. There's no way to compare sins, okay? Don't try to light and heavy your sins. He says, just be silent, meditate. If necessary, repent. If it didn't really apply to you, say, what am I going to learn from this? How can I build my identity as an Israelite? Rabbi Nachman wrote, a person should be prepared to submit himself or herself as an offering to God. Just as an animal cannot speak, so we too preserve silence. And that's how we transform. That's even how trees react. They've measured electrical responses in trees with an EKG. And they compare what happens to a tree when somebody's about to pick its fruit. The electrical impulse will go on a pause. It's like the tree has put itself into a kind of electrical faint. And they say it's very similar to the chemical reaction and the electrical reaction of a lamb right before a kosher slaughter. There's a kind of a fainting of the body systems. It's not like they literally faint, but it's like everything gets ratcheted down. And it creates a kind of a numbness. It's like a self anesthetic. And they say a tree will do that right as it realizes the fruit's about to be picked. It will put itself into this electrical faint, which apparently numbs whatever pain it is a tree feels at having its fruit picked. The point being here, it's not about EKGs and trees. It's the fact that you never hear a tree scream when a human being picks its fruit. I can go pick apples off my apple tree. It never screams at me when I do that. Now, it might be screaming on the inside. I don't know. But at least when I pick that fruit, I have an example there. And when we think of in the temple, there were certain animals that were designated for sacrifice, and there's produce that's designated for tithes and for offerings. And in each case, neither the animals nor the produce is going to scream when it is sacrificed for the sake of temple worship. So if we're human beings, and in a sense, we're at the top of that food chain, then why should we scream when we're called to sacrifice in some way? So in this particular Torah portion, there's a couple of nations, one nation in particular, that keeps coming up, and that nation is Moab. Moab. Now there's also Edom or Edom and Ammon. Now remember, Moab and Ammon are both descended from Lot. They're related to Abraham through Lot. And they were given territories. The Holy One says, you can't take their territory. I've assigned it to them forever. And one of the speculations is, well, why couldn't you take territory from Moab or Ammon? And they say that when Lot went down into Egypt with Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham said, this is my sister, Lot kept his mouth shut. He could have said, oh, that's not his sister. That's his wife. But instead, he just protected Abraham, tried to preserve his life, and kept his mouth shut. And as a reward, his descendants were given property that couldn't be taken unless another nation invaded and took the property or the territory from them. In that case, if Israel conquered that second nation, then they could take territory. But Moab is mentioned. In fact, it says in Deuteronomy 1:5, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, so there's a principle of Moab as a setting that's important for us to understand everything that Moses is going to explain as it follows. And then as we continue through the portion, like Deuteronomy 1:8-9, he mentions the wilderness of Moab. He says, don't harass Moab. Don't try to take their property. Deuteronomy 1:16-19, he talks about Ammon, the younger brother of Moab. Says, don't harass them. Don't try to take their territory away from them. Deuteronomy 2:26-29, he talks about how they tried to pass through the territory of the sons of Esav, who live in Seir. And of course, the Edomites, Edom, Issah, same people, instead threatened them with swords. No, you can't go through. So they had to go around. He brings up Moab again, right? And here's the problem. We're not going to find out specifically as it concerns Ammon and Moab what the real problem is here. But in Deuteronomy 23:3-8, that's when we find out what the problem is. In this Torah portion, the caution is just leave them alone. Don't harm them. Don't harass them. Just leave them alone. But as Moses gets in to the meat of Deuteronomy, he explains what their downfall was. At this point, we're saying, okay, they have enough merits here that you're not going to be able to take their territory. But there's also a problem. They can't be part of you. It's going to be very strict conditions under which they could enter the congregation of Israel. And he gives the reasons why. He says, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, none of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, may ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. That's the number one complaint against Moab and Ammon. And then he mentions the one I would have probably picked as being the reason. He says, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Petor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. And so he says, nevertheless, the Lord your God was unwilling to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. You shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. Now, I didn't put it in bold print, but I want you to put that sentence in bold print in your head. You shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. Why? What would be so grave that a person could do that you're being specifically commanded? Don't seek the peace or the prosperity of that person. Don't seek the peace or the prosperity of that nation. Well, we go right back up in the text. It says, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. They did not extend to you, not even filial hospitality, because they are your cousins. They didn't even extend the common courtesy of the land. The most hospitable people you will ever meet are the Bedouin, who live out in the middle of nowhere, who have very little. But whatever they have, if you're a visitor, if you're a guest, they will gladly share food and water with you. And so if the poorest people on earth have habits of hospitality, he's saying, why in the world couldn't your cousins, the descendants of Lot, meet you with bread and water when you came out of Egypt? Because they already knew, the peoples of the land already knew what was going on with Israel. They knew you had manna. They knew you had a well of water. You might offer to buy the food and the water that you consumed, but you didn't need it because I was already supplying you with these things. If you accepted any of it, it would have only been a token amount. It would have been very little, just for the sake of hospitality and building that relationship, neighbor to neighbor. But they refused to even extend a token amount of food and water when you came out of Egypt. And so he goes on, he says, you shall not loathe an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not loathe an Egyptian, because you were a stranger in his land. The sons of the third generation who were born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. See how different that is? An Edomite or an Egyptian? The Egyptians enslaved their bodies. The Edomites threatened to come out and kill them with swords. But he says the Ammonite and the Moabite are worse, because they were not hospitable to you. And so until the 10th generation, they may not enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, in practical application, the way that it reads in Hebrew and the way that it's interpreted, it's a Moabite female who may enter, but, and I don't want to be too graphic here, but it's the male Ammonites and Moabites who may not enter the assembly of the Lord. The assembly of the Lord, they believe, referring to the female Israelites. And so they say, no, we don't want them marrying in. Can a female Moabite enter in? Yes, under certain conditions. Who would have met those certain conditions? Ruth. Ruth met those conditions. Remember, everything that the Ammonites and Moabites did wrong when the Israelites came out of Egypt, Ruth did it right. Not only does she not meet Naomi with bread and water, she follows Naomi back to her homeland in the house of bread, Bethlehem. And what does she do? She goes to work, and she starts extending hospitality to her mother-in-law. And it's not a matter of going out to meet her, following her, devoting her life to her. And what does she do? She enters the assembly of the Lord, and she becomes the ancestress of King David and Messiah. So can this be fixed? Yes. How can it be fixed? Hospitality, doing good to your neighbor. That's how that happens. And in fact, every year at Shavuot, we read the story of Ruth, because what her ancestors did wrong, a sin of omission, not meeting their cousins with bread and water in the wilderness of Moab, Ruth fixes that in her generation, and she brings bread and water to Naomi. And so this, you offer 2 loaves at Shavuot. Ruth's story extends from the barley harvest until the wheat harvest at Shavuot. And so she's kind of the 2-loaf story. What's going on with Edom, though, is probably still being written. The point here is that he's placing this sin of omission, omitting hospitality, ahead of sorcery. He's placing this sin of lack of hospitality ahead of the Egyptians' enslavement and Edom's sword. That's pretty serious. So let's take it to present day. And let's look at an example from 135 AD. And some of you realize that tomorrow is the 9th of Av. It's a fast day. It's in Zechariah 8:19, if you're not familiar with it. You can also go back through our YouTube videos and find a video, I think it's called The Four Fasts, where we go over the 4 different fasts and what's significant about them and how it even relates to COVID-19, how COVID-19 was proclaimed by World Health Organization on the 10th of Tevet, and how through Ezekiel's prophecy, we can expect that this siege of Jerusalem is the way I'm going to phrase it. This siege of Jerusalem could end tomorrow, depending on how you calculate the months, or that's with an 18-month calculation. If it was the 30-month calculation, which is the other viewpoint, then the siege of Jerusalem, in terms of the plague, it would not end tomorrow. It would go 12 more months until the 9th of Av next year. So it does have a right now, today application, modern times. But we know through history, this has been a particularly destructive day to Israel. We get the evil report of the 10 spies. We get the destruction of the first and the second temples. We get the Jews being expelled from England and Spain on this date. The 2 world wars start on the 9th of Av. And there's another date, you may not be familiar with it. We tend to think of the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD. That wasn't really the end. There were still Jews in Judea. And if you can kind of remember a little bit of history, there was a false Messiah, and his name was Bar Kokhba, son of a star. And one of the famous rabbis of his day was misled. He thought that this was the star that would arise out of Jacob. He didn't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. He says, this is the guy. And lots of people followed him. The problem was he wasn't the Messiah. He was a false Messiah. And we can understand now why Yeshua would have warned his disciples 100 years before, don't just run out there because somebody says that's Messiah. But there was a rebellion under Bar Kokhba. They rebelled against the Roman rule, and they were miserably defeated on Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, 135. And not only was the army defeated, they butchered the population at Beitar, where they had kind of lined up for the fight. And it truly was a butchery. You can read about it in history. One of the things I read says that when they took the bodies of the Jews at Beitar and used them to put them around the Roman vineyards, that it was 7 years before they had to fertilize those vineyards because of the decomposition of the bodies and the blood that seeped into the ground. But that marked truly the exile that endured until 1948 for the Jews. That was on a 9th of Av. We say, well, this is bad. This is really bad. What can we learn about the Torah portion from this particular example? Well, after the fall of Beitar, of course, the Romans imposed again a ban against studying the Torah. You could not study the Bible. And that ban on studying the word was in effect until the death of the Emperor Hadrian. Probably heard of Hadrian's Wall up in England. He was a pretty powerful emperor. So until he died, you couldn't study the Torah in public. You had to do it in hiding. And little by little, the word started to slip away. how ironic it is that today anybody can study the word in most areas of the world, not every area, but most areas, and yet they choose not to. And we're losing a grasp on the word, not because we would lose our lives if we did, but simply because we're distracted by other priorities. I mean, that's simply it. We prioritize other things over the study of the word. And they say it was slipping after this defeat. And so finally, the ban was lifted when Hadrian died. And now they could study Torah again, but now it was very, there was a scarcity of teachers in the Torah because, of course, many were killed, many were martyred, many just passed away. But there's a pattern here in how they recovered the word after the defeat by the Romans that really began the exile. What's interesting is the pattern they used is exactly the pattern that Yeshua taught his disciples 100 years before. And you can't tell me that out of the many thousands of Jews who believed in the book of Acts, that they simply disappeared from history. I truly believe that they influenced and affected the time where the oral law was finally recorded down into the Mishnah, when it was finally put into writing, because there's too many coincidences of where Yeshua taught something more than 100 years before, and all of a sudden it appears in the Mishnah. I believe there was a continuing influence that came down through maybe the second and third generations of those first century believers. Just very sad that they did have to disappear from history. And here's the pattern. Matthew 10:5. It says, these 12 Yeshua sent out after instructing them, saying, don't go on the road to the Gentiles, don't enter a city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Now, this is exactly what happened at Mount Sinai. The kingdom of heaven came near. The presence came down on the mountain. And in Jewish tradition, everybody was instantly healed at that moment at Sinai. That's why so many Jewish hospitals are called Mount Sinai, that everybody was healed instantaneously. So he says, I'm sending you out. I want you to proclaim that message of Sinai. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead. In fact, it's thought that they were resurrected when the commandment went out. It killed them. And then the word had to resurrect them back up. And they go to Moses and say, oh, Moses, you go listen. And then you come back and tell us what he said, because if we hear any more of this, we're going to die. We're going to keep dying. And this resurrection thing is really not all it's cracked up to be when you're terrified. So Moses had to go receive the Torah. And now Yeshua is saying, you go heal the sick. You go raise the dead. I'm putting the word in you. You go preach the word. Cleanse those with leprosy. Cast out demons. At that point, there wouldn't have been any place for leprosy or demons. Because again, that resurrection of dead, they had been elevated at that point before the golden calf. He said, freely you've received, freely give. Don't acquire gold, silver, or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 tunics, or sandals, or a staff. For the worker is deserving of his support. Now here's the part. It says, whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, see that your blessing of peace comes upon it. But if it's not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. And whoever does not receive you nor listen to your words, as you leave that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I say to you, it would be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city. Now, remember what was said about Moab and Ammon. Because they didn't greet you with bread and water, I don't want you to seek their peace or their prosperity forever, for all their days. Don't seek it. Yeshua is telling his disciples the same thing about a city who might not receive them ministering the word. He says, if they will receive you, seek their peace, leave a blessing of peace. But if they don't, they're like Moab. Do not seek their peace and prosperity. If they're not going to listen to your words, take your words with you and go to another city where they will receive you. And then you should seek their peace and prosperity. Your blessing of peace should come upon that house. So this dilemma was presented to the survivors in Judea and Galilee after the ban was lifted on Torah study. And the Midrash says, recognizing the danger of Torah knowledge dispersing and dissipating in the exile, the Jewish sages sent a message to the elders of Galilee and said, let anyone who is learned come and teach Torah, and anyone who is not learned, come and learn. Basically, it's a conference, right? It's going to be a teaching conference. And they invited them to a couple of different cities. One was Yavne. You might have read about Yavne before. The other one was a little town in Galilee called Usha. Usha. It was a little town in Galilee then, and it's a little town in Galilee today. There's a picture of it. It's population 533. So how did Littleusha become a paradigm that we can follow? And perhaps was what happened there influenced by Yeshua's disciples who had been taught this principle over 100 years before. So what happens is the students and the teachers start pouring into Usha. And the citizens of the little town rose to the occasion. Every single teacher and every single student who came either to teach or to learn the Torah, they provided them with everything they needed. They gave them a safe place to sleep at night, a comfortable place. They gave them food. They gave them drink. And so they stayed there until they were convinced that the learning of the previous generation had been repeated and learned by the next generation, which sounds very similar to what Moses did. He's taking the mistakes of the first generation, recounting the words, and making sure the second generation internalizes that. Because what the very fact that they're there says this generation made a mistake. There was a 2x4 generation here. And it's interesting too that one of the patterns they have to refer to this comes from Song of Songs 2:4. So what happened with the 2x4 generation? You had to hit them upside the head with a 2x4. They were hard-headed. And that's the previous generation. They picked the wrong Messiah. They had to get hit upside the head with a 2x4. But Song of Songs 2:4 says, sustain me with apples. Refresh me with raisins. Sustain me with apples. And that word there is ashishot. And they say this sounds a whole lot like the plural of the little town of Usha. And so they use a little play on word there. They say, sustain me with the hospitality of Usha. The students and the teachers, they were so grateful for the townspeople that they got together and said, we cannot leave this city without a blessing. And so they had a big formal gathering. And a great rabbi named Yehuda, who actually did live in that city, he pronounced this beautiful blessing of peace and prosperity upon them. And now they are kind of used as an example in scripture, not in scripture, in tradition, as an example of hospitality. And that hospitality, again, it was based on what Yeshua taught his disciples, which I believe was based in this Torah portion, as it refers to people who would not greet you with bread and water when you had the living word in your camp. The ability to be healed was in your camp. The ability to resurrect was in your camp. The ability to cast out unclean things was in your camp. the Torah covered all these things. They use as an example Exodus 33:7 as to what happened there in Usha. And remember, we've had the sin of the golden calf by this point. Adonai is very angry with the Israelites, and Moses has to intercede to get them atonement. And so he says, okay, have them build me a tabernacle, let them build me a mishkan, and then my presence will reside. It will once again become close to them. But until then, while they're building the mishkan, it says, now Moses used to take the tent and to pitch it outside the camp, a good distance. And that word there for a good distance there is harchek, a good distance from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And so what is he doing here? He says, okay, I'll move my tent out here, and you're going to have to work a little bit. It's not going to be like the presence was all over you at Mount Sinai. It's withdrawn. And so I'm going to pitch my tent out here. The presence is going to be out here, and now you're going to have to walk. If you want to seek Adonai, you're going to have to trouble yourself to go out to this tent. It's a symbol of how you can be in exile, or how you can exile the presence through your behavior, through your disobedience. And so it would be like the way the Jews were feeling after the defeat of Bar Kokhba, who they were convinced was the Messiah. And now they know, well, he wasn't the Messiah, and now we're being exiled. We're going to be exiled from the presence. We're going to have to work a lot harder to preserve the word among us. And so by looking at this tent, they say, well, you know what? We don't stop seeking him. We don't stop seeking the word, because eventually, as he's building the Mishkan, which is exactly what he's doing today, he's building a tabernacle. He's building the body of Messiah. Eventually, the great force of that presence will return. But the sages took that example and said, okay, while the Mishkan's being built, Israel didn't stop seeking the Holy One. They continued to seek him. And they sought him through their teacher, Moses, through the faithful servant. It says Moses was faithful over all the Father's house. And so this Rabbi Yehuda, who was picked to make the blessing over Usha for providing the lodging and the food and the drink so that the Torah could be transmitted to the next generation, he said, so it was that anyone who sought Moses is not written here. Instead, so it was that anyone who sought Hashem is written, the Holy One. He says, from here we learn that anyone who receives scholars, a Torah teacher, a teacher of the word, a minister of the word, is considered as though he is receiving the divine presence. In other words, when you show hospitality to people, you are seeking the presence of the Holy One. And so what was the sin of Moab? They didn't go out to Israel with bread and water. They didn't go out to the servants of Adonai with bread and water. The fact that they didn't extend the hospitality to Israel said they're not extending any hospitality to the Holy One. The Israelites are the physical vessels. Moses was the physical vessel. People around us are the physical vessels. And when we show hospitality to other people, that's an indication that we are actively seeking a return of the divine presence in a powerful way in our lives. So based on some calculations, Joshua 3:3-4, the minimum distance from the ark, from the presence for the Israelites to follow was 2,000 cubits. And so that distance there is rachok. So they say, okay, if the minimum distance for Israel from the divine presence was 2,000 cubits, this is related to Exodus 33:7, harchek, rachok, harchek. They said that would have also been a minimum of 2,000 cubits. Moses would have pitched his tent at least 2,000 cubits from the camp to force them to come out there. And that's the equivalent, they say, of one meal. Sounds like a mile. It's not exactly a mile. but it does come from the same Roman word. What I wanted to point out to you is that this meal, you might want to say a mile, but it's not exactly, the 2,000 cubits has been described as a distance that the average person can walk in 18 minutes. So it took them a minimum of 18 minutes from the outskirts of the camp to reach the tent of Moses. If they wanted to seek Moses as a sign that they were seeking the Holy One, they would have to walk a minimum of 18 minutes. And you know what's sad? Some people wouldn't cross the street to go to a Bible study. Some people wouldn't cross the street to go to a conference where people were teaching and learning Torah. That's pretty sad. They say, oh, I can watch it on the internet. Well, sometimes you have to, because there is nothing close to you. But lots of people are really close to the ministry of the word. And they would rather stay in their pajamas and watch it on the internet or listen to a recording later when it's convenient than put themselves out. Well, look, Moses couldn't record whatever the person wanted and send it to them in the camp to listen to later at their convenience. They had to get up, get dressed, and walk to the outskirts of the camp, which is quite a distance. And then they still had to walk 18 more minutes at least to reach the tent of Moses. They had to trouble themselves in order to study the word. And they say, look, this is what the people of Usha did. These Torah teachers and students troubled themselves to walk long distances to reach the city of Usha. And the city of Usha responded by providing the hospitality. They provided the food, they provided the lodging, they provided the water, they provided the safe atmosphere for them to learn as long as they needed to, until the word was transmitted to the next generation and established in them. They say, this is what matters. They say, if those who traveled only 2,000 cubits to study Torah are considered to have sought God, then you, and this is addressed to the citizens of Usha, you, our brothers, our teachers, scholars of Torah, those among you who troubled yourselves to travel a distance of 10, 20, 30, or 40 mil in order to hear the words of Torah shared at a gathering, much more so will the Holy One, blessed is he, not withhold your reward in this world or the world to come. He's seeking their prosperity and their peace all the days of their lives with this blessing. He says, you know what? You responded to us with food and water and lodging when we were in great need of ensuring the word was transmitted to the next generation. And they say hospitality is the key. Extending hospitality to the stranger who's not truly a stranger. He's only a stranger and maybe you didn't meet him before. But he's not a stranger in that he is either a teacher or a student of the word. And you greet that person with hospitality as a sign that you are seeking that divine presence in your life, that you are seeking his peace and your prosperity in your life. If you can't even meet your neighbor with bread and water, then you don't truly desire his presence in your life because you couldn't stand it. Another thing they pointed out, Elijah and Elisha, they both had interactions with women. And without going into the long stories of each one, you already know them. With one, her son was resurrected from the dead. And with the other woman, her son, she and her son are about to eat a last meal and die. And he's like, make me a cake first. And she makes him the cake. She extends the hospitality, even though that was their last meal. And what happens? The food sustains them until the end of the famine. So what is the reward of hospitality? In this case, to the prophets, Elijah and Elisha. Well, we get resurrection and we get the survival of a son who would otherwise be doomed to die. Do you want resurrection in your children's lives? Have you been praying for your children? Have you been praying for their salvation? Have you been praying for them to come into a deeper walk with the Holy One? Have you been praying for them to be severed from unfruitful relationships? Whatever it is you're praying for your children and your grandchildren, whatever resurrection and whatever survival you have been seeking the Father to extend to your children, he's saying, I've given you the recipe. If you want me to resurrect your son before his time, see, everybody's going to arise at the resurrection, sure. But no, because of the hospitality that the woman showed by building the prophet a little room where he could rest, and by feeding him and making sure that he had the lodging and a comfortable place to stay as he ministered the word, she didn't have to wait till the resurrection of the dead for her son to be revived. Instead, he's revived before his time. Do you want your children revived before their time? Do you want your children to survive the famine? Then show hospitality to the saints. That's the recipe. He's saying, look, you're going to have to trouble yourself. If you want to reach the teaching of the Torah, it's never going to be as easy as just this. That Torah is going to have to come alive in your life. It's going to have to be more than somebody talking to you over the internet. That's a step. It's a privilege. It's a gift that we have the internet where we can teach and learn the Torah. But eventually he's going to take these technological interactions and he's going to put somebody in your path. And you're going to have to extend yourself. You're going to have to extend hospitality. It's going to cost you something. It might cost you food. It might cost you water. It might cost you money. It might cost your time. It might cost you not doing something different that you would rather be doing than entertaining a virtual stranger. But he says, you're going to have to trouble yourself. If you want to reach the teaching of the Torah, whether you are a teacher or a student, you realize there's three people in that recipe that Yeshua taught. There's going to be the teacher of the word or the minister of the word. There's going to be the home that receives the teacher of the word and shows hospitality. And then there's going to be those who are weak and sick and are the beneficiaries of the teacher of the word and the one who extended hospitality. You see, the one who extended hospitality has an equal ownership with the prophet, with the healer, with the evangelist, with the teacher of the Torah. You say, okay, all I have to do is put them up for the night and give them something to eat and something to drink. Pretty much. It's not a 2x4 proposition here, folks. It shouldn't be a 2x4 proposition. Remember, Moses called it a tent of meeting. When he set up that tent outside the camp, he called it the Ohel Moed, which later the tabernacle itself is going to be called the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. This is where you come for the feasts. And he says, okay, I'm going to move it out here for a while. If you want to come to the tent of meeting, you're going to feel what it's like to go in exile to the tent of meeting. And so the people could either have screamed and cried and complained or just said, you know what, I would rather stay in my PJs today. Or they can get up, they can get dressed, they can put their sandals on, they can take their questions with them, and they can make the walk out to the tent of meeting. They can trouble themselves. Same thing with the feasts. You need to find like kind and like mind. Like I said, they had a big conference to teach the word. Well, when it comes to meeting at the feast, you might have to drive a ways. You might have to walk a ways. You might have to put yourself out. It might not be the best camping conditions. But you know what? If you have good hosts and you have good attitude, instead of complaining and fixing blame and saying, well, when I went here, they did this and it was way better than this, or, they supplied this and I don't know what these people, if rather than bringing in our complaints to a feast, instead we brought our gratefulness, like the sages and the students at Usha, the disciples of Yeshua 100 years before, they said, you know what, we're going to be a silent sacrifice. We're not going to scream when somebody picks a piece of fruit off of us. He says, bring your sacrifices without excuses and without complaints. And then you will know you are that next generation, that you're not the 2x4 generation. I mean, even in temple times, there was a practice that when the pilgrims would arrive at Jerusalem for the feast, the citizens of Jerusalem would go out and greet them with refreshments to make them feel welcome. Moab and Ammon, they didn't even show the least amount of desert courtesy. They just didn't want to be troubled from the territory they owned. They didn't want to be disturbed. They wanted to stay in their PJs. And when you don't trouble yourself, it ends up being a much bigger problem than if you went out against them with a sword and actively attacked them. You realize the comparison? If you tried to enslave them and force them to work for you for nothing, that actually not being hospitable is worse than that. So we'll finish with this to encourage you to apply this tomorrow. Start looking for ways to practice hospitality. Romans 12:13 says, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. 1 Timothy 5:10. Remember, this describes an elder woman. What would qualify for her to work within the congregation? It says she must have a reputation for good works. And if she's brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, you see how hospitality to strangers is hooked with the saints' feet? It's like they're strangers, but not total strangers. You're on the same page of faith. If she's assisted those in distress, and if she's devoted herself to every good work, how would she know what good work was unless she knew the good word? That tells you she's been receiving ministers of the word into her home. She's learned, and now she's extending that hospitality to strangers to perpetuate that teaching of the word and the healing of the word and the purity of the word into the community. And then Hebrews 13:2 says, do not neglect hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Imagine Abraham. What does he do? He runs out to meet the 3 angels. And he says, kill the fatted calf. Sarah, make some bread, make some matzah. He brings them some dairy products while they wait. He extends hospitality. He wants them to sit under some shade. Let's get your feet washed. You must be tired. And he's entertaining angels by showing hospitality. And do we for 1 minute think that Abraham would have received the word he received from those angels had he not been hospitable? What if he just let them keep walking? How many words have we not received into our lives? How many promises have not entered our homes because we saw an opportunity for hospitality and let them keep walking? We want to look for the like kind and like mind, even a total stranger, if necessary, but especially it says to those of the household of faith. Look for people who are ministers of the word, students of the word, facilitators of the word, and extend your hospitality to them. And I looked up the Greek word for hospitality, and in the Gesenius, it'll take you back to the Hebrew cognate word. And in this case, it was like a compound word for hospitality in the Greek. And when I took it back and I looked at what it was in the Hebrew, it comes from a verse, 2 words in a verse you know very well. You should love your neighbor as yourself. Reah, neighbor. And ahav, love. In Greek, hospitality is love your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's hanging there with Hero Israel. The Lord your God is one. And love your neighbor as yourself. That's the secret to the kingdom right there. That's the secret to breaking through these spells where you say, well, I've been in such a dry spell with the word. I say, extend hospitality to someone in need, somebody who can teach the word, to a student of the word, sustain a student of the word, like the citizens of Usha. You got somebody that wants to study the word, help support that person. Do they need a study book? Buy them a study book. Send somebody to Israel when it opens up to study at a school there, to learn Hebrew. You say, well, I just don't feel like I can learn Hebrew. I don't feel like I'm good enough in languages. You know what? There's a bunch of young people out there that would love to learn Hebrew, and they don't have the money to go learn Hebrew in the land. They would love to volunteer and build those relationships with their Jewish brothers and sisters in the land, but they don't even have the money for airfare. If you got money for airfare, show that hospitality, help that young person go volunteer to work in the vineyards, to help, to learn how to run the irrigation list. There's always something we can do, folks, if we open our eyes and quit letting opportunities walk by us. And I love, I don't know if it's by coincidence or what, that we have this lesson this week, but I've had company all week in my home. And it's wonderful because when you have company in your home, they're bringing their goodness into your home. And long after they have physically left your home, that part of the divine presence that rests in them, they leave a little bit of that in your house. And I can look back in our history and think of all the guests we've had in our home here, especially people of like kind and like mind, students of the word, teachers of the word, facilitators of the word, people who just very quietly put funds, they put just money into the orphanage. They're investing in the kingdom, not because they believe in me or they believe in my husband. It's because they believe in the Holy One, and they say, okay, you just happen to be the one sitting in the tent that he's chosen for this job. And so to show my commitment to him and his cause, I'm going to sustain this work. And so whether they just come and share their presence with you, share a little bit of the spirit that's upon them, and they leave a little bit of that in your home. Think of all the wonderful people who have moved through your home that you've shown hospitality to. And what you do is you look around and you realize this house is not made of the decorations, of the paint, of the furniture, of the window treatments. This home that we have here is also made up of all the people who have ever visited us. And even by visiting, they extended hospitality to us. So it was your house, but yeah, the presence of that person, Yeshua told you, that's part of the hospitality equation, the visitor, the visited, and then some third party out there who's going to be the beneficiary of that transaction. So I would encourage you right now, start thinking of those transactions. Do I need to be a visitor somewhere? Do I need to be a host somewhere? Or am I in a position where I really need to benefit from where there's been that transaction? So many people, I think, went home blessed from Revive, either from the praise and the worship, being able to worship or to dance with people of like kind and like mind. Maybe they formed friendships, partners in faith, or just not feeling alone. They might have come from an area where there isn't anybody like them. And they do have to depend on technology. And all of a sudden now you're face to face with real human beings, You're having that transaction that Yeshua taught about. And so think about that. Can you be like those citizens of that little bitty town of Usha, where they said, we're not going to let the Torah die out because we didn't extend hospitality. We're going to find a way that this generation, even though they may have been a 2x4 generation, nevertheless, there is value even in being a 2x4 generation, because now you can turn to the next generation and say, you know what, don't do what we did. We did some stuff we shouldn't have done. And there was stuff we should have done that we didn't do. But let me tell you about it. And the righteous in that next generation, they won't accuse you. They won't blame you. They won't cancel you. Because they will say, you know what, I don't want to erase this history. This history is a valuable part of who I am and who I can be. Don't cancel. Don't erase this history. I want to be like that second generation listening to Moses and saying, what can I learn from the mistakes my parents made? What can I learn from the mistakes my grandparents made? If I cancel their mistakes, then I cancel the very thing I can learn from and then pass on to the next generation, because that generation that followed Joshua was like no other in terms of obedience. And so just keep that in mind. There's so many ways to show hospitality. I can't tell you how grateful we are for the people that contribute to the orphanage. And you say, well, that's not hospitality. I'm like, yeah, it is. If it's loving your neighbor, it's hospitality. If it's being part of a transaction and ministering the word to someone, either through ministering to their bodily needs or their spiritual needs, it doesn't matter. You're ministering to their needs. You're fulfilling a need. That's the definition of ministry, by the way, to fulfill a need. And so, it might be that you're standing at the cashier at the gas station and something tells you, tell the clerk you're going to pay for that person's gas. And you don't know why that thought crossed your mind. And you don't know, was that the Lord or not? And while you're sitting there thinking, maybe the person drives away. But maybe that person set out on their journey and that was the last dollar they had. And so while we sit around and think, well, did the Lord really say that? Can I really afford to do this? Is that just a dumb thought? That opportunity to extend hospitality got away. And you know what? It wouldn't really matter whether you were right or wrong. What would matter is that you believed that you were obeying what the Father said. This person needs somebody to make a difference. And sometimes we have to be really quick to jump on those opportunities. I've looked back in my life and I have seen where I had an opportunity to help somebody. And I thought about it too long. It was just like when Deborah was trying to raise an army with Barak. And it says some of the tribes, they just kind of sat around and thought about it. Well, should we or shouldn't we? There was great musings, great deliberations of the heart, it says. Well, while they sat around deliberating, a few tribes went up with her and got the victory. So we want to take those times to say, oh man, I missed it there. I really could have helped those people. I really could have helped that person. Don't beat yourself up. Remember, we listen to our mistakes so we can learn from them. And you say, okay, now I get it. I'm not supposed to beat myself up because I missed an opportunity. I'm not supposed to beat up the previous generation because they didn't teach me right. They didn't do right. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. Quit beating up on the church. Quit beating up on people. Listen to what they did wrong and say, oh, I can learn from that. I get that. And so I'm going to have an opportunity to do a little bit better. And I'll do my part. That will be the whole point of my recognizing that there was a failure back there. Because if you just beat yourself up, you're still going to miss opportunities, right? It just freezes you. You say, okay, I get what you're saying. I get what Moses was saying. I get what Yeshua was saying. Make a difference when you can, when you see an opportunity. And I know you will. You wouldn't be here listening to me when you can't talk back to me. That was second generation. They didn't talk back. They just said, okay, all right, we got it, Moses. Well, you wouldn't be on here right now if you didn't already believe what I was saying, and if you didn't, to some extent, already know what I was saying. So I think I'm just helping you. I'm reminding you of things you already know. That generation, they saw their parents make those mistakes. So Moses wasn't springing a new thing on them. He was simply saying, remember this. Remember this. Learn from this. And I know you're going to do forward and do marvelous things. You're going to go forward with Joshua, and you're going to go into the land because you know how to be a silent sacrifice, and you don't scream when somebody picks your fruit. I think I still scream a little bit sometimes. I do, but I'm working on it. I'm learning from it. So I am going to I do still have company, so I'd like to spend some time with them, especially while we can still eat before the fast sets in this evening. The fast is a full day, evening to evening fast. So if you're physically fit, it is a total fast. If you're not physically fit, of course, you can always moderate that. If you need to drink, for medicine and those sorts of things, we don't encourage killing yourself over the Torah because you're supposed to live in the Torah. But to the extent that you can, remember tomorrow, all the historical things that happened. And then think about tomorrow as also being a historical day in your life, where you were going to take your hospitality up to the next level. Because when you take that hospitality up to the next level, you are going to begin to experience those blessings of peace and prosperity, which is what the Father wants for you. So just grab those opportunities to do the good works and to extend the hospitality to those of like kind and like mind. And I know you're already doing it, so I'm just trying to give you a good reason to keep doing it. Okay. So I'm going to let you go so I can spend some time with my company. And B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see you back here again next week. If you didn't realize we had a double header today, then please back up the videos on our channel here, and you can listen to Colonel Michael Farley do a presentation on the same Torah portion, and you'll get a double blessing. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We love you. We're praying for you, and we hope to see you again next week.